Welcome to the Darkstream. VoxDay, voxday.blogspot.com, and Infogalactic News. As you're aware, there were two big news events today. One was the shooting of a Republican congressman and some of his aides and some police that happened in Alexandria, Virginia. The other was the fire that took place in London, in Kensington, and may have killed considerably, it looks like it killed considerably more people than were killed by this gunman, James Hockington, the left-wing Bernie Sanders supporter. You have to feel a little bit sorry for the media. They've just been so desperate for, an alt-right terrorist to go in and shoot up something, and they finally get somebody shooting congressmen, and it turns out to be a Bernie Sanders supporter. Go figure. So, anyhow, the reason I'm bringing up this discussion is because it's from something that we were discussing on the blog, talking about on the blog. And I apologize for those of you who are not interested in philosophy or religion, because that's what we're going to get into tonight. If you just want to talk about, if you just want to talk about the shooter or something, I think Mike and Scott have already covered that pretty well, so I don't really see any need to. Anyhow, so what I was looking at was, we got into this big discussion because this fairly well-known Calvinist preacher named John Piper, somebody's reporting that there's an active shooter at Travis Air Force Base. That sounds a little bit more like Muslims than Bernie Bros, but we'll see. Keep you posted as things go on. But the question is, if we look at, so we got into this discussion because this pastor, and he's somebody that I've been familiar with his church since I was a kid, and some people that I know actually attend there. And so what got me thinking about it was that he was doing something, again, that I consider to be reprehensible. This is the same guy who was talking about how the tornadoes that killed some people 2 years ago was actually Jesus stretching his fingers across the land and killing people for the glory of God. Now, this strikes me as theologically insane, irresponsible, and utterly ridiculous. What I posted on today was almost equally ridiculous. He was praising interracial marriages. He was actually praising the Loving versus Virginia Supreme Court case and talking about how interracial marriages are an indication of Christian glory, blah, 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 blah. This is not Russell Moore. This is John Piper. I personally think that John Piper is possibly the worst wolf in sheep's clothing in the United States that I have seen. I mean, the man, as far as I can tell, is just dedicated to transforming biblical Christianity into pure, emotion-driven, worldly favored churchianity. I mean, when I even read the stuff that he writes, it makes me cringe. I mean, I feel somewhat the same way reading his stuff that I would reading 120 Days of Sodom. Or, it just makes your skin crawl. It's so obviously and smugly wrong. And so, anyhow, because I mean, it's going on about this stuff, and of course, I mean, you're talking about a guy here who actually went and adopted a African girl, literally virtue signal. I mean, this is his own statements make it clear. I went and adopted this girl to make a point. I mean, who does that? So anyhow, so that's what got this thing. And there's been a big debate on my blog before. You can look it up. If you do a search for Team Calvin, you can see that some of the Calvinists on the blog put together some questions, and then I addressed them and dealt with them. No, I don't believe that John Piper is honest in any way, shape, or form. I've read enough of his little sermonettes and stuff to be highly confident of that. Plus, also, I understand that he has, his concept of good appears to largely be there so that he can serve as some sort of role model or whatever. Anyhow, but what I realized when we're talking about this, because get back to the point, was the fire evil? Was what happened to those people evil? What do you think? Yes or no? Well, actually, the comments are kind of coming in and out, so we'll stay away from that kind of engagement. I mean, it could be, it could be that it was arson. It could be that there was criminal negligence in the way that the building was built. But if the story is true, first of all, the fire itself can't be evil because the fire has no agency. Secondly, if it was an accident, then it was nobody's fault. It just happened. Somebody made a mistake. Most people would not look at that. If what happened, if the story of the exploding refrigerator was true, and if it's true that all the stuff that they put together, if it's true that all the changes that were made, the environmentally friendly whatever changes to make the building look prettier and more updated and stuff, if the new cladding was actually up to standard, then no one's gonna call it evil. On the other hand, what about the shooter? Was he evil? Was it evil of him to go there and shoot up these people who were politically different than him? I think we would say it was evil. But let's postulate this. What if he knew about Pizzagate, and he knew that everyone who was involved in that baseball game was an elite pedophile, guilty of raping and murdering children? Would we still consider him evil? It's a little trickier there, isn't it? Suddenly there, he's defending the innocent. Now, I don't believe that's the case. I do not believe that is the case. I'm simply pointing out that these matters can be a little bit more complicated than they look, and they are further complicated by the fact when we start bringing in the concept of the divine into it. Right? And so, when we talk about what the Calvinists believe, or at least many of the Calvinists believe, it's kind of tough to nail them down because they have enough disagreements among themselves that they tend to be very shifty. Like, for example, they love to bring up God's sovereignty, but I have pinned different Calvinists down to 4 different definitions of God's sovereignty, some of which preclude free will and others of which do not. You know, I'm a Christian. I do not deny God's sovereignty in any way, shape, or form. But sovereignty is like the Queen of England is sovereign. That doesn't mean that she controls every single movement, every single decision, every single action in England, just because she's the sovereign queen. So, anyhow, that's where it starts to get tricky, because then suddenly we're going, okay, well, if God really has, if God, like the omnidirigent Calvinists say, has the whole world in his hands, and has a plan for you, has a plan for me, not only has a plan for us, but actually forces us to walk upon that path and controls our movements. You know, did I do that? Was it my will to do that? Or was it God acting through me? I personally, now the thing is, of course, if we are puppets, if we are just, meat AIs being controlled by our programming, we wouldn't know it. So we can never count out that possibility entirely. I want to make that very clear. I am open, entirely, 100% open to the possibility that I'm wrong. Okay? It is possible. But I've been given a brain, I've been given the ability to reason, and we've been given God's word through the Bible, or so I believe. So we have clues. We have the ability to observe. We've even been given a heuristic by the Apostle Paul. He tells us to test things, judge them by their conclusions. So we have all these tools. We have all this stuff. Okay? And so when I use that sort of thing, it becomes readily apparent to me that God can control things when he chooses. He can force issues at specific times, but most of the time he appears to be hands-off. Now, again, we all have a tendency to create a concept of God that is somewhat based on ourselves. So I'm a game designer. I'm a game developer. To me, it is not at all difficult to imagine something that is set up to run, largely left alone to run as it sees fit. But then if you want to make sure that the scenario ends a certain way, you put a piece or two on the board and you make sure it happens that way. Okay? That's what I believe to be the only way to resolve these various pieces of information that we're given. The Calvinists get all bent out of shape when you point out things where God clearly says he's surprised by something or he didn't know something. On the other hand, there are some very clear verses where he says, hey, if I create, some people are jars created for destruction. Okay? But that doesn't mean everyone is. Maybe, let's take the case of Judas. God needed Judas to do what he did in order to get Jesus crucified. Right? Jesus doesn't get betrayed. They don't crucify him. Mankind is not saved. Okay? But in order to make sure that Judas does his part, does that mean that everybody else had to have their actions being being moved. No. In that particular scenario, now I'm not interested in you talking about your theories about who freely chose. You have no idea. You have no idea, so just stop. The point is, we're working with a hypothetical here. In order to make that happen, only one disciple needed to have his role set in stone. Now, I'm not saying that it was. I'm just coming up with a hypothetical example of how you might need to pre-program one piece in order to make sure a scenario went a certain way, but that does not mean that everybody needed to be programmed. So if you look at these things, it seems to me to be the only way to rectify the apparent contradictions, both from the Bible and from our own observation, is to view it from a balanced perspective that says we have as much free will as God chooses to give us, and most of us throughout human history have been given that free will. It doesn't mean that everyone necessarily has, but most of us have. And so, and I think that we can actually, because now how do we get from, why is there this connection between this Calvinist belief in control and what we see in modern churchianity? Because modern churchianity, the whole idea that racism is not only a sin but the worst sin ever, the idea that nations don't matter, that everybody's the same, that we should welcome refugees and celebrate diversity and all that other bullshit. I mean, first of all, we know it's false for one reason. We know it's false because we can judge the fruits of it. We can use that heuristic that Paul gave us. We can see that what comes of it is bad. We can see that what comes of it is evil. We can see that what comes of it is detrimental to almost everyone. There's nothing good about it. There's nothing of God in it. Second, also, all this stuff, this diversity, this churchianity, this this Cuckservatism, it's invariably cloaked in dishonesty. It's invariably cloaked in lies. So if it's all lies, we know it's not coming from God. How do they justify it, though? How do they justify it? Oh, wait, I forgot to mention. So we know that it's false. We also know that it's not Christian. How do we know that it's not Christian? Because it's new. The Orthodox Church didn't teach it. The Roman Catholic Church didn't teach it. The Protestant Church didn't teach it. Nobody ever taught it until after 1965. So it's not legitimate. It's not Christian. It might present itself as Christian, but then wolves like to present themselves in sheep's clothing. It is revisionist Christianity. It is, in two words, fake Christianity. But here's the thing. A lot of people find it convincing. Even a lot of Christians find it convincing. Why? How? And I realize why they find it convincing, but now I also understand how to destroy it, logically and biblically. So the way that they build up their churchianity, the foundation upon which their churchianity is built up on, is basically one verse, which is love your enemies. Love your enemies, love your neighbor. Love your enemies and love your neighbor as yourself. Right? Okay. Those are commands. Those are commands from the Bible. But if you apply it the way that the Churchian does, if you apply it the way the Cuckservative does, what is the only conclusion about who your enemy is? What's the only conclusion about who your neighbor is? It means that in both cases, no, what it means is that in both cases, enemies means everyone. Neighbor means everyone. And that, A, is not true, B, is not possible, and C, is not biblical. How do we know it's not biblical? Number one, if you are, let's talk about the neighbor. When Jesus was talking about the Good Samaritan, what was that an answer to? What question was that an answer to? It was an answer to, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? And what's more, he was asking about the neighbor to the Samaritan. No, I'm sorry. He was asking about the neighbor to the man who was injured by the robbers. So the first three people, that examples he gave, the priest and whoever else walked past him, they were not the man's neighbor. So what does that mean? No. What did we just talk about? We just talked about how, according to the Churchians, neighbor has to mean everyone. But we know from Jesus' example that is not true. We know that everyone is not your neighbor. Furthermore, we know that everyone is not your enemy. When he says, do good to those who persecute you, why would he say do the good to those who persecute you? There's also those who don't persecute you. There's also your friends. Okay? Those who persecute you is not everyone. Your enemy is not everyone. So the core foundation of churchianity is false. It is a lie. We can even go further. How can you possibly justify killing your enemy? How can you, especially if you're operating under the, what is the command about loving people? You're supposed to love them as yourself, right? So, am I going to let myself break into a home and rob a family and rape the wife and murder the children? Am I going to permit myself to do that? Would it be a kind and loving act to step back and permit myself to do that? So, if you are loving your neighbor as yourself, you are going to stop your neighbor from doing that. You are going to prevent him from doing that. That is the core moral justification for Christian self-defense. This is not a The point is that the whole core of this Churchian foundation has been built up on obvious falsehood that is based on specific interpretations of specific verses that violate and are in open contradiction to other things. Therefore, what do we know? That particular interpretation has to be incorrect. It cannot be correct. And so the fact that this incorrect and false foundational churchianity is also in conflict with 1,900 years of Christian tradition, and it is thoroughly 100% approved of by the world, means that we know it is false. I mean, we can actually draw some further conclusions if we want to, but we'll leave it there for now. So that's what I want you to think about, and what I want you to keep in mind when you're thinking about good and evil and right and wrong and that sort of thing is your neighbor your enemy? Because if those instructions to love people means everyone, the neighbor has to mean enemy. And beyond that, one further note that I want to add, let me see if I can pull my train of thought together. When Jesus says, do good to those who persecute you, he does not say, do good to those who persecute your child. He does not say, do good to those who persecute your neighbor. Is it loving your neighbor to help him be robbed? You have no right. You have no right to forgive or permit anything that is happening to anyone but yourself. Everybody knows I'm not a big fan of John Scalzi, right? So let's say that you go out and you beat up John Scalzi. Okay? So are you good if I forgive you? Hey, I know you punched him a few times and you broke his glasses, but I forgive you. That's ridiculous. It's utterly ridiculous. You have not committed a crime against me. You have not sinned against me. You have sinned against him, and he's the person whose forgiveness you need, not mine. So, anyhow, that's just my perspective. I had a few thoughts on the matter, so I thought I would share it. Just whatever you do, whether you're a believer or not, do not ever confuse this churchianity with genuine, traditional, biblical Christianity. They're just not the same thing at all. Have a good evening.